Okay, this is going to be the Russia Part 3 lecture. I'll finish Russia Part 2 in class. This is about citizens, society, and the state, about divisions in the society, about what civil society and civil participation look like, and really about ways that the government has limited participation in government. This picture's hilarious. Here we have this little boy. Putin bends down to talk to him, and then here's his reaction. All right, so the first thing we need to talk about are the social cleavages. The most significant cleavage in Russia is related to nationality. 80% of people are ethnically Russian, and then you can see the breakdown of other groups. What's important to know about nationality is that ethnicity, nationality tends to be a coinciding cleavage. It corresponds with people's region and usually with their religion as well. So I'll talk more about religion on the next slide. It's not going to be important that you know each of these groups. I would make sure you know that 80% are Russian. And then when it gets to religion, I would make sure you know that Muslims are growing in population. And then you will have to know, when we look at these regions, you will have to know the region of Chechnya and what has been significant there and what their complaints have been and what they've done in response to wanting independence. Just some terminology, Ruski versus Russiki. So Ruski means you are Russian by ethnicity, and this is a term for all other ethnicities that is used in Russia. And then, like I said, Chechnya is an important region. It's primarily Muslim, and that's growing. They have fought for independence. Just to give you a little bit of background, this group has also been responsible, people in this country, in this region have been responsible for some terrorism related to their fight for independence. In 2004, which was probably the most notable incident, Chechen terrorists held a group of school children hostage, and about 300 people were killed, including children, in that incident. Since then, Chechnya has worked for independence. They've not been able to achieve it because there are some... Did you drop your book? Pout pout fish? Okay. Here it is. Here you go. So they have fought for their independence, but there are some trade agreements that make it preferable for them to stay part of Russia. I'm going to talk a little bit later about what was done to sort of convince Chechnya to stay in the country and to put down that independence movement. If you're interested, you can kind of pause here and take a look at this. This looks at the breakdown of ethnicity within Russia and where people tend to live within the country. The next important cleavage is related to religion. So this is really interesting. Most ethnic Russians would identify themselves as Russian Orthodox, but during the time of the Soviet Union, all organized religion was banned. So religion, it didn't die out completely, but it really, really faded in significance during the 20th century. So most people today are largely non-religious. There are other religions that are represented in small percentages. The Muslim faith is growing. It's estimated that by 2030, about 14% of the population in Russia will be Muslim. There's also a small presence of Roman Catholics, Protestants, and Jewish people. So as I said, there's a rapid rise in the Muslim share population. Oh, thank you. Don't do that. Okay. So other types of cleavages would be social class. So in the USSR, during the time of the Soviet Union, it really was about who was part of the Communist Party, the members of the elite, versus non-members. That's really changed. Today, it's about the wealthy versus the non-wealthy. So there's a small class of really rich people. I know that the idea of the oligarchs came up in one of the presentations, the Russia policy presentations we did in class. The oligarchs are a small group of people that controlled much of the industry following starting in the presidency of Boris Yeltsin. So Boris Yeltsin, during his time in office, he engaged in an economic policy called shock therapy, where he very quickly privatized much of the production of natural resources. And so that included privatizing oil companies, coal companies, natural gas companies, and the oligarchs were people who became very wealthy very quickly. So now you've got this tension between oligarchs and the working class. By our standards, the middle class in Russia is very small. Under Putin, we've seen more of the government taking over some of these industries that the oligarchs are influential in. So you've seen the oligarchs fade in importance a little bit, but this is still a pretty significant tension. You also see a tension between the rural and urban societies. 73% of people now live in cities, mostly in the western part of the country. And people who live in the cities are more likely to be well educated. They're more likely to be in touch with Western values. That's another tension that we see in Russia, is this pull toward integration, globalization, westernization versus nationalization and independence and focus on, Russia first, basically. Political culture is also an important idea. So political culture looks really different in Russia, as you might imagine, than it does in the United States, or that's my son talking about the pout-pout fish. So it looks really different in Russia than it does in the United States or in the UK. So, as we know from looking at Putin and from looking at the political structure, just the way the Constitution is written, Russia has a tradition of very centralized leadership, beginning in the times of the Soviet Union, even before, under the Tsar. So that has not changed. Are you talking about pout-pout? Did you drop it?
Do you want to hold pout-pout?
There you go. Most of the government is mistrusted. We have a history of a population that's very alienated from the political system. They historically have not been able to participate in government until the 90s. There was no voting. And even now that mistrust continues, because even under Putin, and especially in the 2012 election, there were many allegations of fraud. And we'll talk a little bit about that. So people tend not to trust the government. People have a history of being the subjects rather than the participants. So you might see a question on the exam or on the AP test about this difference and about what participation looks like in Russia, where people don't feel that their participation matters, versus in, UK, US, where participation is critical. Russian political culture is characterized by statism and collectivism. So and by statism we mean that the people expect the state to take an active role in their lives. You don't hear this idea that you might hear in the United States, where people are complaining about big government. People are accustomed to that. They expect that the state will play a role. Now, they're in disagreement about what that role looks like, and especially now as the government continues to limit civil liberties, there are more and more complaints about this, but statism continues. This is fascinating. Collectivism is this idea, that it stems from communism, and it's this idea that we distrust those who get ahead. So there's a phenomenon that I'll talk about on the next slide related to collectivism, but that also stems from the presence of the oligarchs that emerged during the 90s. These people who became rich really quickly were very much mistrusted. People felt like they were getting rich on the backs of others, and that was unpopular. There is a desire for order and stability, and Russians, as we've seen, for a number of reasons, have been very agreeable to, giving up personal freedoms. They've been, they've tolerated a lack of civil liberties far more than we would do so in the United States in order to maintain that order and stability. So this is fascinating. There's an article about this. In Russia, when a contestant on the show, which this is funny to me this exists there, Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, asks the audience for help, the audience usually gives the incorrect answer. And so we're not going to be able to talk about this in class, but it's based on your understanding of Russian political culture and values. Why do you think they give the wrong answer? Which is just hilarious because it's so against what we would see here. And the answer goes back to what we just saw on the previous slide. It's about this collectivism. People don't like this idea. They distrust people who get ahead, especially when you're trying to get rich on the backs of others. People are against that, and they are much more in favor of collective values. And so that's just fascinating. Some more terminology that's important here, the idea of a Slavophile versus a Westerner. So Slavophiles are those who prefer nationalism. They want to preserve traditional Russian culture and Russian interests. They prefer a strong military. They're against globalization. They reject Western values, integration. Westerners, those who would be characterized as Westerners, are more the reformers. They're in favor of integration. They're in favor of globalization. They're in favor of implementing Western values. So Putin's supporters tend to be, well, as you can imagine, most of them are Slavophiles. They're against major reforms. They want to maintain Russian interest and Russian values, and they're fearful of influences from the West. All right, compulsory. So, you had a 100% turnout. Now it's not forced, but it's still, relatively high. It was about 70% in 2008. In 2012, it was about 65%. 2012, we saw some major complaints about alleged voter fraud in the province, in one province in particular. Putin's opponent received 1 vote, and turnout was reported at 107%. So after the 2012 election, you saw an increase in riots and protesting related to voter fraud, and those protests were quickly put down, and they didn't really make a difference, but people are becoming increasingly unhappy with reports of fraud. Since 1991, we've started to see the emergence of civil society. Okay, so remember, civil society and the definition of it are super important. Remember, civil society is not the same as just political participation. Civil society is not the same as voting. Civil society involves voluntary groups, so people deciding on their own to form some sort of organization related to an interest. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a specific political interest. It could be the Boy Scouts, and that's civil society. Under Putin, there are many obstacles to forming voluntary organizations. The government makes it very difficult to register to be in a voluntary group. They have to report all of their, financial situation. So all the money they make and spend has to be reported to the government, and it's often done in a challenging way. They're supervised very closely by the government, so it makes it really difficult for that to happen. In 2007, and this is something I think is super important if you see something on the test about ways that civil society is limited, this is an example you can use. In 2007, the Russian government put new laws in place restricting the use of public demonstrations and protests. There are lots of rules. Basically, individuals are allowed to picket. They have to be 50 meters away from any other individual. If a protest has more than 100 people, the rules get even stricter. They have to be a certain distance away from public buildings, and if it involves a government building, there are even stricter rules. And again, all people have to be a certain distance apart. So there really are very strict limitations on public protests. I asked both policy groups to talk about this, but in 2012, and this is just a popular, example that tends to come up a lot in AP comparative classes and possibly on the test. In 2012, there was a punk rock group called Pussy Riot, and they were arrested for protesting in front of the Russian Orthodox Church because that church supported Putin in the election. Their charges were hooliganism, and they were jailed for 2 years, and they continued to be advocates for Russian civilians and for the rights of prisoners. So they're an example of, limitations on free speech, limitations on political participation in general. There's another movement within Russia called the Other Russia. It's the opposition movement to Putin, and it is growing in significance. This is pretty fascinating. So under Putin, we've seen the creation of Russian youth groups. The largest one is called Nashi. There are also groups called the Youth Guard and Locals. So this is an example of civil society. You know, these are voluntary groups, but Putin created them. So there's a lot of criticism that these are sort of indoctrinating groups. These groups exist to build a loyal following of patriotic young people, to instill in them a pride in Russia, to instill in them a fear of Westerners and of integration. These groups are allowed to organize mass marches and demonstrations within Russia. So pretty fascinating. The idea here, to get people started at a young age and start to train them in the ways of Putin, I suppose. Propaganda is a major part of Russian society. The government very much promotes Putin. I think this probably came up in both classes, but media is very strictly controlled by the government, which is something else you might include. There's not a free, open media. People who criticize Putin may find themselves jailed. So that's something else you might consider for the exam. Okay, I wanted just to touch on a couple of things that didn't have a great place elsewhere, but items from previous AP tests that came out. One thing I'm going to have you guys do for your third quarter exam, there was a question that in the past that gave some information about Russia, and I'm going to ask you to look at that data and then write a normative statement and an empirical statement. Remember, a normative statement involves a value judgment. An empirical statement is simply based on the statistics and the numbers. I'm also going to ask you to identify Russia's dominant political party and to explain ways that the party is able to remain dominant. I'm going to wrap that up and go over that a little bit more on Monday in class. Then what does a cow say? Moo. Okay. So another just sort of interesting question that came up in the past. I found it to be just a little bit random when I came across this, so I wanted to make sure you saw this. The question was, name a natural resource on which Russia is dependent. So you could say oil, natural gas, coal. And then this is kind of what I was mentioning about nationalization. So under Putin, the government has really nationalized many of these natural resource companies. It's reduced the influence of those powerful oligarchs. And what Putin does is he gives control of these companies to those who are loyal to him. And the question then went on to say, what has been a political consequence? Well, when we give more control of companies to the government, we've seen increased corruption, diminished power of the oligarchs, strengthening the Putin regime. Those are things you could put. And I may use this question on the quarter exam, possibly. Last thing, and I've been mentioning this throughout, a previous question on the AP exam asked, what caused, an outbreak of protests in 2011, 2012? That was the year, when accusations of electoral fraud became really common. People were complaining about corruption in the government. People were becoming more and more concerned about the way Putin was consolidating power. The protests were not effective. And some reasons were that, again, the state controls the media. When you look at the voter turnout, it appears that there's popular support for Putin. And the civil society is very weak. I just talked about those limits that are placed on mass protests. So that makes the ability for people to respond very low. And that will wrap it up. If you have questions, please feel free to send me an email. And we will wrap up part 2 in class on Monday. Ben, say bye-bye.
Say bye-bye.
Bye-bye.